Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's really happy to see all of you here. And actually, I will add one special audience today. The Dean of SCI-Arc, Ferda Alonso. Probably he's going to be joining us soon. Let me briefly introduce the four. Actually, we planned 5, but we have 4 today. Timothy Morton, he with some family member passed away today, so unfortunately he cannot come. But we're gonna definitely invite him for next time. Don't worry. And let me introduce briefly our 4 great, amazing guests. First, I would like to introduce David Rowe. David currently is the postgraduate chair in Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. As well, he is the co-director of architecture firm Rowe and Klein. And we have Graham Harman, the liberal arts coordinator in SCI-Arc, as well as he's one of the most contemporary influential philosophers in the world. And also we have Ferda Kolatan, the associate professor in University of Pennsylvania. Also, he's the director of a practical architecture firm in New York named SU11. Also, we have Michael Yang, assistant professor in Uni, and he is also the co-founder and director of his firm in New York, Yang and Ayata. So, as I already said, Timothy Morton cannot join us today with some personal reason, but we're gonna meet him soon. So, let me just say something about the format of the discussion. So today we're gonna have 2 hours discussion, and the first hour basically is David and me. I will release 4 questions between we two, and during the answer process, David gonna also cue Ferda, Michael, and Graham to join a little bit, but mainly we two are for this clue. And then after 1 hour, I will give the chance to let David take over the moderator to go depth into the questions we collected before we start this event from online, because we have a lot of amazing questions from the audience. So we specifically picked 4 can stand all these general issues. So then for professors, for the first official start of our first half panel, maybe David, I think you can take 2 to 3 minutes, introduce to us yourself, what are you interested in now, and what kind of interesting stuff are you doing now? So yeah, thank you, David.
I guess I'm interested in problems related to nature, technology, and architecture. I could introduce myself, give you the 1 hour version or the 1 minute version. So that's my 1 minute version. So let's leave it at that, because I know we don't have too much time. Yeah, okay. It's nice to see everybody online.
Okay. Okay, so before we start the 4 questions, please allow me to release a little bit background in Chinese in terms of the speculative realism, one very important philosophy trend. And also I will introduce in Chinese how David and Graham meet each other again. And then how our philosophers and our amazing architects collaborate and read each other during the past 10 years. So, so for this part, I will take more or less 3 to 5 minutes in Chinese in order for our audience to get these ideas and background easier. So then we will start in English for all the 8 questions. 说汉语了。最开始的时候，我们主要把握3个时间，2011年以及2011到2012年，就是2007年的时候，时间点是那个思辨实在论，就是那个 speculative realism 这一个哲学动向的兴起。然后2011年的时候是 David 和 Graham 2个人的再次见面和相遇。然后11到12年的时候就说就相当于Graham 和我们的建筑师们开始合作和互动。然后具体来看的话，就是说回到2007年，我来稍微讲一下这个第一次思辨实在论的哲学会议。这个哲学会议是在伦敦大学的那个金史密斯学院召开的。然后当时的主要的议题是批判当时的欧陆哲学， 以康德的思想为代表的欧陆哲学。然后这也是那个 OOO 的，就是我们以后可以叫或者谈话叫 Triple 的那个以物为导向的分体论的开始。这次会议呢，当时有4位非常著名的哲学家共同发起，分别是昆廷梅亚苏，也就是我们著名的法国哲学家阿兰巴迪欧的学生，然后还有我们的哲学家布拉希尔，还有那个伊恩哈米尔顿格兰特，然后再就是 Graham Harman，一共这4个教授。然后呢，在当时关于这个思辨实在论这一个思潮，尽管他们用了同一个名字，但是实际上其实这4个人是互相持不同的观点，然后互相不同意彼此的观点，所以说可以说4个人有4个不同的思辨实在论观点。但是如果说我们粗略的进行归类的话，前3个人除了 Graham 之外的前3个人，他们更多的是关于知识和认识论的思辨实在论，所以说大概他们走的是那个方向。只有 Graham Harman 自己走的是关于物和本体论的这个方向，就是我们讲的这个以物为导向的本体论。所以说这是基本的这个哲学背景。那么就是回到第2个阶段，就是怎么着 David 跟 Graham 相遇，他们是为何一个建筑师和一个哲学家进行合作也好，并引发了后面这一系列的这个形式的发生。那么就说是其实最早的时候呢，1991年的时候前后David 跟 Graham 他们是大学本科的同学，他们都是在哲学系学习，然后在美国马里兰州的那个圣约翰学院。然后1991年的他们毕业之后，2人就失联了，因为那个时候互联网也并不发达嘛，就很容易就失联，所以说大家也没有很容易的联系。然后后来的路径就是说 Graham 呢自己就是继续他的哲学硕士、哲学博士，然后 David 呢从哲学转向了建筑，在哥伦比亚无纸化实验室开始求学，然后毕业之后在 Princeton 和多伦多哥大以及Yiqun开始任教，并做很多这种当时关于数字化的探索。然后就这样就过了20年，到了现在，其实不是到了现在，过了20年，到了2011年，他们再次相遇。当时是一个契机，也是一个网上的契机。当时因为 Graham 后来做了美国开罗大学，在埃及的美国开罗大学的哲学系的教授。然后当时埃及正兴发了一场政治运动，就是我们也都知道的阿拉伯之春。然后那个时候呢 ，David 人在纽约，他就每天不停的在网上去通过博客关注当时这个埃及的这个情况。然后呢，他就很偶然的时候发现了一个很有意思的一个人写的一个博客，就是详细的分析了这一系列的事件。然后他就对这个人产生了兴趣，发现这个人的名字叫 Graham Harman， 然后他就联系了这个人，就问，哎，你是不是当时我那个同学 Graham Harman？ 然后后来他说是的，我就是。然后这就是2个人在20年之后再次相遇。然后这个时候 Graham 已经成为了一个非常著名的哲学家，然后 David 也已经在美国各大著名高校开始教书。然后这个时候呢 David 就开始读 Graham Harman 的著作，然后就惊奇的发现，那么在过去的20年，2个人在哲学和建筑的不同道路上，其实是在秉承着同一个价值观，在做各自的探索。然后这样一来David 呢也就把他的这些哲学作品推荐给他当时的秉承着和 David 相同价值观的朋友，比如说我们的建筑师老师在 UCLA 教书的 Jessie， 还有当时在Penn 教书的 Ferda Kolatan， 所以 Ferda 今天我们也来了。然后大家都会觉得大家都觉得非常惊讶，都觉得就是说原来我们很巧合的都在做同一件事情，就相当于说大家哲学家跟建筑师在镜子面前看到了另一个自己一样。那么这个时候就说他们就开始加速疯狂学习的过程。Graham Harman 开始读建筑学的书，然后这些建筑师们也开始深入研究这个哲学，尤其是这个以物为导向的本体论的这个著作。然后就有了第一次国际会议，关于Triple O， 就是我们叫 OOO 或者说 Object-Oriented Ontology， 和建筑学的对话的第一次国际会议是 Ferda Kolatan 在伊斯坦布尔土耳其组织的，名为 Objects and Crafts， 就是说物与工艺数字时代之后的审美范式这个名字的这个研讨会。然后当时参会的有5个建筑师，有4个建筑师和1个哲学家，哲学家自然就是 Graham Harman。然后我们有另外4位建筑师，分别是伦斯勒理工学院的现任的建筑系主任 Rita Rosso， 然后 UCLA 的老师Jessie， 然后还有当时的那个 David Roux， 还有 Ferda Kolatan。然后这就是第一次国际会议的契机，2012年11月23号。然后在这次会议之后 美国包括世界范围之内的各个建筑学院就开始关注object-oriented technology 的和建筑的这种未来的可能性，会不会产生一个新的，就是说哲学跟建筑学联姻之后的范式转换。然后非常有远见，就是 SCI-Arc 当时的那个硕士项目主任就是赫尔南迪亚兹阿隆索，在2013年9月份的时候，9月18号邀请了 Graham Harman 到 SCI-Arc 做了第一次的演讲，当时的那个题目叫陌生之物，反对参数主义。这个演讲也是说是一个历史的里程碑。9个月之前呢，另一个里程碑是 David Roux 带进来的，就是说当时也是在 SCI-Arc，2013年的1月30号，一场名为这个 Returning to Strange Objects 的讲座，就相当于拉开了建筑师对这个建筑思潮的一个认识。所以说自那之后到现在的大概10年左右，很快这个 Triplo 就传播开来，然后大家也开始对这个什么是 Triplo 的形式语言开始了各自的探索，就是大家都是建筑师，比如说 Mark Gage，在我们耶鲁的那个前副院长，然后他当时就比如说用这个 kit bashing， 这种可能类似于一种3D 拼贴的一种手法来探索这种形式语言。还有 Tom Westcott，在 SCI-Arc 的那个本科学系主任，然后他的这种 position， 他的立场就说是在做物中之物。那么说，但是呢，至今就说是经过这么多年的探索，并没有说是有谁来说我找到了这一个真正的关于 OOO 在建筑中的形式的式样，这个是目前是没有的。所以说，或许呢这种式样可能并不存在，也或许这种式样并没有被找到，或许这种式样需要我们中国建筑师和学者来共同找到。所以说，这也是我们办本次活动的初衷，就是说将这个探讨的语境和话语带到我们中国的观众和学者的里面，然后我们一起来推动这个事情，看是否有机会在中国形成一种新的思潮和讨论。Okay, so I just finished the brief. Sorry, it's maybe not brief. The introduction background of speculative and object ontology and architecture. So let's go straight forward to the questions we're going to do in the first half session. So let me ask the first thing based on the background I just mentioned to our audience. Back to the 10 years before, like around 2012 and 2013, more and more architects and architecture universities are started to get curious about Triplo. So why Triplo became so popular at that time? So maybe you can just say something about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll have to start by rewinding the videotape to the 1980s first to understand why everything was so ripe and ready for these ideas. So in the 80s in the United States, we're in the middle of historical postmodernism. And this was the period when I was just entering into architecture as a young student. And generally, by the late 1980s, historical postmodernism was not very well liked. There was a lot of criticism of it. And if you were a cool young person, the last thing you wanted to do was historical postmodernism. There were reasons for this. Historical postmodernism was seen as a kind of, I guess, a thin veil over commercial, corporate, very expensive architecture. So skyscrapers in Manhattan, shopping malls, apartment complex, they're all essentially still modernist, but with funny hats on them and a thin facade of fake stone to make it look like something older. And it was generally perceived as very cynical. Now, this was important to mention because when I entered into graduate school at Columbia University in the mid-90s, this was a very important period for our group because this was when the first paperless studios were started in this giant transition to digital technologies. What's lesser known about this period was the conceptual background of this transition to digital technologies. There was a lot of criticism of historical postmodernism. And for somebody like me, there was great appeal of new theories, like with Jacques Derrida's deconstruction, or a little bit later, Gilles Deleuze's theories of becoming, because it was in many ways a response to what was seen as this very cynical retreat to historicism, as a kind of mask for commercial interests. So for somebody like me, it is relevant to mention I am a South Korean immigrant in the United States. So my entire life already, I had felt a little bit disconnected and alienated from the American culture. So when I heard professors like Kenneth Frampton talking about modernism, I couldn't help but feel a little bit like, well, that's not my modernism, because I'm not white and I'm not from Europe. You know, it's something that I really didn't feel connected to. And then further, even worse, historical postmodernism making things look like Greek temples or 16th and 17th century European architecture. Again, it did nothing for me. It's not my culture. It's not something that I felt any kinship with. And even worse, it was only paper thin anyway. On the other side was still modernism. So later on, I came to understand my own sense of alienation as being in many ways pretty common to, I guess, what it means to be modern anyway. I think we all feel a little bit alienated in that way. And I know you know what I'm talking about, you know, those of you that are here. We're all sitting here on a grid. We're all a little bit alienated. And I think the philosophies of Derrida and later Deleuze, it was very exciting because it spoke much more closely to how reality seemed to me. So it was a very exciting time. So I have to emphasize this in the 90s. And it coincided with this movement towards digital technologies. And that's a very interesting thing to understand, because Deleuze's ontologies of becoming fit strangely well with what computers seem to be promising us, that now we'll be able to measure and absorb and adapt all these invisible forces that we normally don't have the ability to deal with because it's too complex. So today we think of this as some kind of parametric problem, you know, that there are all this data out there, all of this complexity in the world. And then the question becomes, what should the form of architecture be? And this is something that emerges in the mid-90s in the East Coast of the United States. This idea that the technology can somehow be at our hand. We can use this new tool to then maybe only my colleagues here will understand it if I put it this way, but it's a kind of tool for accessing the plane of immanence, you know, as to use the Deleuzean language. But maybe in a more basic language, here's a new tool for just dealing with all the complexity that we could never deal with before. And then there's this promise of a more fuller, richer, truer architectural form that's based on this complex context of forces, data, numbers, influences, politics, financial data, whatever it is that you want to measure. You know, that form, architectural form, is somehow something that emerges out of that. Now, by the time we get to 2011, like 10 to 15 years later, we're all getting a little sick of this idea, because we all realized the really good architects were cheating. The really good architects were not actually accessing that plane of immanence. They were really clever architects were not actually mapping forces. They're merely using that as an argument, to say, this is actually how we produce this form. But because I was there, what it means to bring form into the world. And we just knew almost practically, pragmatically, like empirically, that that's not how we were designing. You know, so we wanted a much more truer articulation of how it is we're doing what we're doing.
Okay.
So the ground was very well prepared to meet Graham.
Exactly. Okay, so I think it's really slow, and so maybe I think as Ferda and Michael and Graham here, maybe do you want to cue anyone to say something also in terms of this topic? David?
Yeah, Ferda and I, we were colleagues throughout this period, and we went through Derrida and Deleuze together.
Yeah.
Ferda was also in one of these paperless design studios at Columbia.
Okay.
Yeah. I think David touched really well on the main issues. I was actually in the first paperless, which was in 1994 in fall. But there were a couple of studios prior to that that were already dealing with very similar issues. So even though it was the first paperless, meaning we were not allowed to touch a computer at all, there was the fertile ground was already there. I don't know, maybe one thing I want to add to David's sort of brief historical narrative is the transition. For those of you who don't know, I actually grew up in Germany. I'm originally from Turkey. I went to architecture school first in Germany, in Aachen, for 6 years, rather straightforward modernist education. And then I came to Columbia University precisely because all these interesting things were going on in the mid-90s, and I went there for my post-professional degree. So I ended up at Columbia because what I thought was happening there was basically the exact opposite of my own experience.
Yes.
What is similar is that we had in Germany also, you know, come to a point where postmodernism, or historical postmodernism, as David puts it, had basically left us with not much to do, not much and much to produce, because the way how we perceived it, it was kind of an ideology that no longer believed in progress, that no longer in novelty. And for a young person, that's not a good signal at all. It may not be a good signal for anybody in the creative field, certainly not for young people. So the digital, on top of the things David was saying, was also in the beginning so attractive because it promised the opportunity to actually innovate again and to do something that, because the technology is new, therefore the architecture would also be new. And that carried, I would say, the early years. It was filled with experimental work, really interesting experimental work. But then it hit a wall. And what happened, as far as I can see, is that two main trajectories bifurcated. One went into this sort of what we today call parametricism, and the other one petered out in rather very idiosyncratic, navel-gazing architecture that wasn't able to communicate on a larger plane at all. And that was, to me, around, yes, 2009, 10, 11. That was about the time. And I remember as if it was yesterday when David came to me, and we were driving together in a car, and said, you know, I actually reconnected with somebody who's really interesting, who I've known for a long time, but we had our ways had been separated. It was Graham. And that was the first time I heard about OOO, and we immediately began to talk about it. And I got my first books about OOO, not only Graham's work, but other work as well. And then it was really at the point where we understood something had to change for us to engage the topic of architecture in a way that was relevant to the time. Because the digital really began to do things that were no longer, in our own opinion, productive at all.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think it's very thorough also, and let's move to the second question. So just like as you mentioned, both of you mentioned, like the collaboration between philosopher and architects has already generally been started at that time. And also, as now, almost all of you, you guys are teaching everywhere. Actually, always have some collective work, like collaboration between each other, like philosophers collaborate with architects, and architects collaborate with architects. So, how do you evaluate the word reading and misreading among each other? So, like, how do you read the mind and ideas among each other?
So Graham and I, we went to the same college where we both studied philosophy and math. I guess that's what it amounts to. That's what their course catalog says, Graham. And and you may be amused to know, Graham, you probably don't know this, but my senior preceptorial was with Eva Brand, studying hermeneutics. Yeah, and so hermeneutics is an interesting word. I guess it's the craft of Hermes, the Greek god Hermes, who was the messenger between the gods and the humans, right? So Hermes, he was fast because he had to go between the gods and the humans. So that's an interesting word. Hermeneutics is the term given to, I guess, the study of how we read. You know, what is the right way to read? So it comes originally out of Christian Bible interpretation discipline. I'm not actually religious in any way, but I found that to be philosophically a very, very interesting problem. Because if you think the Bible is written by God, then you're going to make damn sure you're going to read that book correctly, because you don't want to get the message of God wrong, right? So it quickly becomes a real problem. There are many ways to read a text. There are many ways to interpret words. You can misread words, and you could get the intentions of what's written completely wrong. We've all misread things. So it sets off a very long, fascinating history as a kind of branch of philosophy, where the problem is, how do we read? How do we know the mind of the author? What are the different strategies we have for reading correctly? Okay, so I think your question, I start out this way because there is a problem of misreading versus reading. Then, you know, there is the possibility of getting it right, I think, you know. So it's not always, I'm not so cynical to think that it's always some form of misreading. Although some branches of post-structuralism make that argument that we were always misreading in some way. I don't actually agree with that. I think there are better and worse ways to read. And so I think what I'd like to maybe just make clear where I stand is, I think we got to do everything we can always to read correctly. And even if reading correctly sometimes means creatively misreading things. And this is my interest in the literary theorist Harold Bloom, whose theory of where do masterpieces come from is fascinating, which his theory is masterpieces are nothing more than creative misreadings of previous masterpieces. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, I think there's a very big difference between this kind of serious and creative misreading, right? Like I don't know, maybe somebody like Peter Eisenman creatively misreading Le Corbusier. You know, there are serious versions of this, I think, that lead to new great works. However, this, I think we have to distinguish from deliberate, disingenuous appropriation, where we just cherry pick the terms and words that we kind of find useful and then drive our own agenda with it, use it for our purposes to get ahead. That I have zero interest in it. In fact, I think it's ethically questionable to do that. You know, so what is ultimately important here is there is a possibility of reading, and I think that's something that we shouldn't discount. In some respects, I think we should recover that principle of reading properly. I think through the post-structuralist period, we might have maybe gone a little too far with questioning the context influence on how we read. So I think what I've tried to do from the beginning with Graham and also with my colleagues' work and influence on me, the work of Michael and Ferda, I am always trying to read their work carefully and to try to understand what it is they're doing. I don't want to flip through Graham's work and just cherry pick, you know, the terms that sound sexy and then I appropriate and do something with it and justify my work with it. And there's quite a bit of that happening, you know. So I think that's something everybody should be careful about. I think investing your time trying to get it right, I think is of utmost importance. And then I think later, then what do you do with the work? I think the right way to do it is to just let it affect you, try to understand it, let it affect you, and then go do your work without really trying to apply it.
Yeah. Maybe. So here we have the idea come from the architects. Maybe I think we can let Graham say something like about that. How do you think about this issue, and like how you feel like people are already trying to read you, and how you think this kind of like a phenomenon. Hey Graham, maybe you can say something.
Sure, I've got a few thoughts about this. One thing is I'm working on a book now called Architecture and Objects. And so a lot of these things are on my mind right now. I just finished writing a chapter about Norberg Schultz, his book Genius Loci. And what's interesting is that he completely misreads Heidegger, although it's very productive. Heidegger has this fourfold of earth, sky, gods, and mortals. And Norberg Schultz takes earth and sky in the literal sense of meaning that every place on earth has its own special relation to earth and sky, which Heidegger is not talking about earth and sky in the literal sense. Those are nicknames for ontological structures. But because of that misreading, Norberg Schultz is able to do something very interesting. Now, where I think David is right is that for me, the relationship between philosophy and architecture signifies a lot of hard work, because ever since David and I got back in touch, I've been working very hard to read all the buildings, and it's hard work. It's a very steep learning curve. And so I'm not interested in accusing architects of misreading me, when I'm just struggling very hard to become competent in what architects talk about. And so there's a lot of work involved in any translation, or even if it's a misreading, it takes a lot of labor to make one thing intelligible in terms of another thing.
Exactly.
And I guess it was the fall of 2011. I was still living and working in Egypt then, and I was in New York during the month of September 2011, the 10th anniversary of 9/11, the big disaster in New York. And I was giving a series of 6 or so lectures there, and David and I and another classmate met socially, and then David gave me a ride home to where I was staying, and we started talking about the relation of triple load architecture, and I had no idea what he was talking about. I had been invited to speak at the AA in London once in 2008 by Theo Lawrence, but that was a one-off thing. It didn't really blossom in anything. It was just an interesting discussion that lasted one day. And so my first question to David was, tell me 10 architectural books I need to read so that I don't make a fool out of myself in conversation. And he gave me a good list. And I think 8 to 10 books is a good number for any fields. It's not enough to become an expert in any field, but it's a good enough number that you kind of get an idea of what the various positions are, and you can learn from listening more to others. It's a good start. And I've made my own list of 8 to 10 philosophy books for people since then, in case they ask me, how do they need to become literate in philosophy? So it's just, after that, it's been an incremental building step by step. trying to become somewhat literal in what these architects are talking about. And visual art was an area I was somewhat more familiar with, but there's an important jump between visual art and architecture. That's what I'm writing about right now. What are the essential differences between visual arts and architecture? And also, several of us did a dialogue in Log. It was David and I and Todd Gannon and Tom Wiscombe. It was called
The Turns.
The Object Turn?
The Object Turn, right.
The object turns, yeah.
They translated that.
Into Chinese?
I'm
and then I went back, Log chose this somewhat contrarian graduate student, Brian Norwood, to respond to us. And I was thinking about Norwood's response again recently because I was writing a response to it for the first time. And what he's basically saying is that appropriations of architecture by philosophy are always too literal. Right? That people are always taking Deleuze's idea of the fold and putting folds on buildings, or they are making things clash and collide because Derrida writes about things that are clashing and colliding. It seems to me that that's wrong. It seems to me that the most recent period of architects importing philosophers has been this sequence of Heidegger, Derrida, Deleuze. And it belonged to this basic period where I think people were responding to modernism since the 1960s and trying to find a way to get back past the excessive rationalism of modernity. And I think to some extent these these philosophers were of an assistance to architects, even when they are misread. It doesn't matter so much that they're misread. The phenomenological architects, who are not so close to what my friends here do make productive use of Heidegger. The deconstructivism show, which isn't just based on Derrida, but also on Russian constructivism,
yes,
is one of the classic shows, maybe the classic show of the last 50 years. And they just look at the people who were in it. These are arguably 7 of the most important architects of the past half century, even if they can't all be called deconstructivists to the same extent. The curators chose the people wisely. Deleuze maybe had less concrete impact, but theoretically he's been out there for everybody.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's true that these philosophers were worthless for architecture. I think they all have their upside and their downside. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And since architecture is always stimulated by other disciplines, I don't see why philosophy alone should be excluded just because a few people think it's been overly literal. So those are some of my thoughts for now.
Okay. Thank you, Graham. Okay.
Sure.
So after we finish the discussion between the collaboration among architects and the philosophers, also another question, like everyone going to be curious about, like, are there going to be any OOO building being built or being designed, or it's like what should OOO building looks like? First, before you guys generate this discussion, I would say, like, definitely Michael has said before, I don't believe there is a OOO building. So I think for this part, also David and Michael, I think both of you should say something. Maybe David, you start.
Yeah, I just want to lead by saying I have maybe an unconventional idea of what architecture is. For the most part, architecture is the thing that keeps the rain out. We live in it. It's got to be practical, and it's expensive, so we got to be careful with our resources, and we have our conventional ways of building, and there are insurance companies and contractors, and there's a lot going on. There's, not to mention, law, building code and things like that. But underneath it all, after thinking about this for most of my career, just what the hell is this activity that we call architecture? Because even Alberti, in almost 400 years ago, said architecture is not merely building. Architecture is something in addition to just building, and it's always been a little bit difficult to say what that extra part is. So one day it just struck me when somebody looked at one of the things I had designed and said the thing to me that might be the worst thing that you can say to any architect, which is, I don't think that's realistic. And it was very upsetting to hear that, but then later I was thinking, what a funny expression in English to say something is unrealistic. Because it wasn't, the comment wasn't it's unbuildable, because it was buildable. And it wasn't wouldn't have been that much more expensive than normal either. What I realized the comment ultimately was something much stranger. It was a comment that it doesn't look normal. In other words, it doesn't look like reality. That's when I started thinking that what we call reality has a stylistic problem built into it. In the United States during this quarantine period, we keep hearing on the news all the time this phrase, the new normal. This is the new normal. You know, this virus isn't going to go away anytime soon. Who knows, right? But everybody keeps saying, no, this is the new normal and get used to it. And I guess another way to phrase that, this is a new version of reality, which I think is just a very interesting thing to observe about it. Now, I don't know if any of you have recently been somewhere in nature. You got to go pretty far into nature these days to get away from architecture. When was the last time you have not been around architecture? You know, I can't even remember one. You know, and so you know I have trees behind me and bushes, but this is my garden. This is architecture. You know, this is in my home. You know, this is a very strange artificial manipulation of plants laid out in a grid. So my basic understanding of what architecture is architecture is the thing that tells us what reality looks like. And because of that, I think there's a lot at stake. And because of that, I think it is intimately related with philosophy. Because I think in many ways, philosophy is also about the same thing. I think it is a kind of fundamental investigation of our relationship to everything else, or everything's relationship to everything, you know, but there is a question of what is reality at the center of it all on some level. So I think there is a question of style and reality here, or reality being a kind of style, that there is an aesthetic component of the reality problem. And I think this is basically the very complex answer to what a OOO building should look like. Because when we ask that question, what should a philosophically engaged architecture look like, or specifically, what should a OOO influenced architecture look like? I think we're asking, how should we edit our reality? How should we design a reality? I think that is what's at stake in this question. So with that, I tee it up for you, Michael Young.
Yeah, Michael.
Thanks, David. Yeah, there's this phrase that I like to say that relates to what David is talking about too. That as architects, one of the things we're responsible for is the aesthetics of the background of reality. And it's a very serious responsibility. This is something to not take lightly. A lot of times there's a frustrating thing that happens within architecture where aesthetics is belittled or treated as secondary or treated as derived from more important discourses like ethics or epistemology. And this is part of why one asks, what does a OOO architecture look like? Because what people are imagining is that somehow this new philosophy will then be the justification and driver of a new kind of aesthetic. And this relates to also what Graham was talking about with the trajectory of Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze. Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze were very productive for architectural ideas. The moment they got reduced to being the causation of a specific style, the producer of a specific aesthetic, they became problematic. And it was not that they were too literal, it was that they were reductive in the ways in which aesthetics operates. So to me, one of the most interesting things about what OOO and Graham's writing released was not only to bring me back to that question of our responsibility as architects for producing the aesthetics of the background of reality, meaning all the things that we deal with that kind of form the ways in which we assume the world to look, these kinds of background, tacitly things experienced in a state of distraction, to say that we have a responsibility to question the ways in which those things appear. And to think that they can appear other is to get us into a situation or a position where we can question the ways in which we assume reality to be. So that means that there is not one, in my misinterpretation or interpretation, there's not one way in which OOO becomes a building. There's not one aesthetic production from this philosophy. Instead, it puts us into the position where we are continually asking ourselves, how does aesthetics redistribute, alter, question? And realism in a certain way has always done that within art. It has always been the kind of artwork that produces a tension between reality and its representation. More closer to Graham's writing, the kind of gap, the friction between an object and its qualities.
Yes.
And it's in there that I think we have so many things to talk about, but also so much that leads us away from ever defining this is specifically what a OOO building looks like. I don't think that's
to emphasize, I think because we've been through modernism and we've all been educated in things like the 5 points of the new architecture, I think there is a kind of expectation we have. Please tell us the 5 points of OOO architecture. But I want to point out, the moment you do that, it's no longer OOO. You're doing modernism with just some words changed. Any reduction to a set of basic principles leading to a rational practice where the architectural work is nothing more than an illustration of conceptual objectives, I think you're doing modernism again. You know? So I think you have to take a different approach to architecture moving forward if you were to be influenced by this.
Okay, nice. Okay, thank you, David and Michael. So here we come to the last question for the first half panel. It's like after all of this discussion above, and it has been 2 years. Sorry, it has been 10 years past. So I would like to say how you guys think about this kind of like a big picture for now has been generated. It's like where are we now? Or we say what is the current state of this conversation for OOO and architecture? I hope that for this part, all of you guys give us a little bit of interpretation. Yeah. Maybe David, yeah.
You know, if you go really radical about the idea that we're somehow trapped in a world of illusion and reality is maybe not what we think, kind of like the Matrix, or kind of maybe hardcore Buddhism, that we're kind of trapped in a world of appearances. And if you go all the way, maybe you might even conclude nothing's real, that there's nothing there, that we're just in a world of images and nothing's real, right? I completely disagree with that. And I think maybe that's something the four of us and people who do gravitate towards speculative realism, and I think you should pay attention to the actual words, realism, you know, is there. I think there is something there, but what I call reality may not be that. So I think maybe I just want to distinguish between what we might culturally or socially agree about. This is conventional, this is normal, this is the right way to do things. Well, that's possible, but that's not the world as it is. You know, this kind of thinking is the kind of reality that I would say is a little bit more of a style problem. Although that may be strange, maybe to some of you, for me to say reality, for the most part, nothing more than a style. But I truly believe reality is a kind of agreement. It's a social agreement about, you know, what's normal. So I think where we're at now, especially in the United States, but it's not just in the United States anymore. I think you've heard this term fake news, where, you know, there's more and more debate about what is a fact and what can we trust as information. And Michael and I, decade ago, 10 years ago, we were interested in parafictional art practices, fine art practices, where like a photograph that's been heavily manipulated to look like something like a real documentary photograph, you know, and Michael and I have been fascinated, and Ferda too, about like what kind of ideas this, why is this happening in the art world? And we decided it was mirroring a lot of anxiety that was in culture already about not knowing what's real anymore. You know, you don't know if this thing is photoshopped or not. You're not sure if this article is based on the facts or not. And we have maybe more distrust of that than ever before as a global culture. So I think that's kind of where we're at right now. So I think we've all been a little bit shocked at how quickly this has happened. I think maybe, you know, Ferda, Michael and I, we thought maybe in the distant future, this was going to become a problem, but it happened very quickly, you know. So I think we're all trying to grapple with this problem of what constitutes a fact. And maybe we might need to have a different method for determining what is a fact today. And this is not a problem altogether different from the architectural problem, you know, because I think they're built into the problem of building. So I think that's kind of where we're at right now, you know, and so especially today, models and data have become the new sovereign in the world because of the pandemic. I don't think anybody will make a move anymore without checking the data, you know, and I think something very important has changed, I think, now because of this. So there is this odd dichotomy between, on the one hand, we don't know what a fact is anymore, but on the other hand, we've never been so dedicated to finding the facts. And I think this is a big open question right now for the coming 10 years.
Okay. Thank you, David. Yeah, maybe Ferda, how about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I want to get to that question. Before I get there, I just want to say something in regard to the relationship of philosophy to architecture that was discussed earlier. Just my quick, you know, 2 cents. I find it almost absurd to think about architecture without philosophy. And if you look at the tradition of architecture, at least in the Western narrative of that tradition, and you look at the Greek polis, you look at the Roman civitas, you understand that the birth of architecture as something that is being put and become a city is intrinsically linked to making policy, to becoming a citizen, to becoming a society of sorts. And you cannot do any of this and become any of these in the development of history without clearly understanding what the philosophy of the people were at that time, and how that actually became architecture, materialized, you know, and manifested in terms of matter. So but there has been just over centuries a shift away, particularly in the last century, where, you know, from philosophy it went more towards, let's say, criticism and other ways of thinking in which architecture became sort of engaged in other disciplines. But it's truly at the very heart. I mean, you just have to go back in history and you see that these are really two sides of a medal. And since I look at architecture primarily still as a tool of cultural production, it would be crazy not to try and understand what are the leading thoughts of our time and how we can reflect on them in terms of architecture. In terms of your other question, where we are right now, there are probably a number of different ways of answering that question. Something that I'm interested in, I'm thinking and writing about lately is what it means if objects no longer have an origin, which is in principle also almost a 100-year-old question. Now, very famously, Walter Benjamin was the person who first began to talk about the loss of originality, or aura, which he tied to originality, the here and now. And the loss was caused by technological reproduction. So it's an old theme and it's tied to technology. Technology comes in and it removes something that is dear to an object, and the value is sort of being sucked out of that object, right, as sort of kind of an image. Now, if we fast forward to the 1980s, you have people like Baudrillard talking about the simulacra as a kind of a real acceleration of that process. And then when we look at today, it seems in many ways, as David pointed out, from a slightly different angle, related angle, but slightly different, it seems that all we have are images in some way. So the objects we're talking about are images, and the images are the objects. And what they do in an interesting way, and that's kind of where I feel there's some interesting relationship to Graham's philosophy, is there is almost a flattening that's happening through certain kinds of technological media, social media, image media, where everything can exist at the same time. And for many of you in your generation, you know exactly what I'm talking about. To us, we were never raised that way. We would always sort of look at the world in its relationship to history or tradition, or even if it wasn't history of avant-gardism, where you reject history, but you would still kind of try to go deep. You would not try and go flat. But it seems right now there's just no such option, because it seems going flat is more interesting and more quote unquote real than going deep, because I don't know where we're going when we're going deep at this point. There's of course also the notion of flat ontology, which kind of goes right in here, right? That there is something within these image objects that may help us or may allow us to combine or think or hybridize, a word I use a lot, in ways that were completely prohibited in an older ideology of architectural production. Right? That there's some kind of quote unquote liberation that image objects represent to us. And with that comes a new kind of opportunity. But it's a radically different idea of architectural production than, let's say, again, a modernist avant-garde model, which aims to change the world, believes in novelty and technologically driven novelty, which will bring a better society, right? I mean, those kinds of narratives. It's very, very different, right? It's the kind of technology that has sort of almost flattened all these ideas and simultaneously confronts us with this proliferated world, and within which, as architects, we have to put bits and pieces together. There's one thing I want to say, and then I mute my mic. There's a beginning in Graham's book, The Quadruple Object. I think it was the first book I actually read. I had seen a couple of essays before, but that was the one I read cover to understand or get into the philosophy of Graham. And I believe he is starting it with this image of his desk. Graham, you can correct me if I'm mixing up the books, but you're describing basically your desk, and you're saying, you know, you're basically suggesting we should start from naivete, right? And it's a really interesting take on Descartes, you know, who himself is kind of starting with sort of a kind of, by rejecting every type of knowledge and then, you know, building up his own way of thinking. But in Graham's world, it's that desk, and then he's picking certain objects and he's talking in a sort of quote unquote naive way what they are. And that really stuck with me, and it reminds me a little bit to the situation we're in, right? There is sort of a real usefulness in naively looking at the objects that we see today. Again, in my world right now, that's sort of the, you know, uprooted, no origin type objects, and ask naively what they are and how they may relate to each other in ways that otherwise we would have never thought of. I mean, that to me is one thing I'm interested in, maybe to kind of really think and work with further.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. So as you just referred to Graham, so maybe we let Graham say something, and then Michael make a summary. Okay, Graham.
All right. What I was going to say about reality and parafiction and fake news is that one of the most powerful statements I ever read about art was from the British novelist J.G. Ballard, a science fiction novelist, who says that the role of the artist has completely changed in our time. It used to be that the artist produced fictions. Today, we are surrounded by fictions, and it's the artist's job to provide realities. And I think of the architect in those terms as well. Someone who's trying to anchor us in reality. This is something that the architectural phenomenologists get right, ironically. They call it the need to find an existential foothold for human being. So I think the creation of reality is a very important theme in philosophy as in the arts. Trying to find some contact with the real. We hear a lot in philosophy these days about making contact with truth, as in Alain Badiou's philosophy. He thinks there are 4 kinds of encounter with truth we can have: political, amorous, scientific, and artistic. I'm more interested in contact with reality, because when people start talking about contact with truth, it's not long before they claim that they happen to have it personally. And they think they know what that truth is.
So true.
Whereas reality is something a little more slippery and something that demands perhaps a lifetime of trying to come to terms with what it means. So I'm always looking for points of contact with reality, points where I can, modern philosophy looks for foundations, unshakable foundations to build on. I look for shakable foundations. I look for points of uncertainty to build on, because uncertainty is the most real thing we have. Any certainty we have can disappear, and uncertainty never disappears. And so that's what our contact with reality is based on. What is the paradox that has been driving you your whole life, or the mystery that you've never quite understood? What is it that surprises you most in your intellectual life? That is the right thing on which to build, not the certainty like for Descartes.
Okay.
So.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Okay, Michael, it's your turn. So you give us the final conclusion for this question and how you think about that.
Sure, I'll add something here. And this relates to what David, Ferda, and Graham said. And it's about architecture's relationship with realism and with images. We have this thing that we're able to do because we can control and change the ways in which the physical background appears. But as we all know, we don't make buildings. We always have made representations. And from Alberti till today, one of the representations that we as a discipline have been suspicious of is the image. Why? Because it's almost too powerful. It can create too much influence. It can deceive. It can become used for nefarious means. It can become an act of seduction that is able to spurn on realities that are not actually the real. So what architecture has constantly done over 500 years is to counteract this problem of the image. We've gone to the model. The model has been our version of modeling reality as opposed to visualizing that reality through imagery. And that has led to constant problems. And it's led to constant arguments throughout the whole history of the discipline. Today, images are models. Images are modeling reality. The way in which the image is searching through the internet, the way the image is monitoring your attention, the way the image is creating new possible reals. So there's no way that we can continue to hold somehow this difference between image and reality being at odds with each other, nor can we claim that architecture should be done through models instead of images. Instead, all we have are image objects. And those image objects are making aesthetic decisions and distributing information in ways that are outside of our engagement. There's a manner in which the images are becoming independent, semi-autonomous from our interaction with it. And if we don't begin to treat them as real in their own right, we're going to fall prey to this kind of problem again and again and again. So that's my kind of connection to all of this as well. Images are aesthetics, images are real, images are objects, and we have to treat them as such.
And also one thing I want to add that I think Michael has launched his research in it's like the Roma Prize. I think this topic is specifically deeply related to the thing like our image. Maybe also you can mention a little bit about that.
A little bit about what I've been doing in Rome.
Yeah, that you focus a little bit quite a lot on the image. Yeah, just to mention a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the research that I've been doing over the past year in Rome, and the book project that I'm working on as well, is about exactly these issues, exactly these problems of the image and the image's role within architecture and its history, and its kind of changing manifestations within contemporary society. And it is, you know, this we tend to forget how often we rehearse problems before we address them. And there's constant moments throughout the history of architecture where we've come down to this kind of question of what does the possible reality look like? What does the plausible reality look like? And what is the location of doubt? And this is this goes back to parafiction as well. How does an architect create doubt in the ways in which reality looks? And we do that through mediations, all of the mediations. And all of them are not models that give us more access to the real. They're models that change the ways in which we think the real behaves, looks, operates. And that is today, by and large, being handled through something we call an image, even though it's not truly an image in its historical manifestations, because images are information, and images are an exchange of information between machines in ways that are in excess of how we've typically thought of them before.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you, Michael. So, so David, do you think we should take a short break, or we can continue? Go to the second half.
I don't mind continuing on.
Okay, maybe let's continue. Go straight forward. So in the second half, we're gonna discuss also another 4 issue. These 4 issues basically came from the selection of the numerous questions we collected before this event from our audience. We selected 4 questions that can pretty much cover the issue we concern about. And I think David's gonna moderate this a little more compared with me, and then generate a more deep discussion based on what we also talked in the first half. Okay, maybe David, you can start.
Yeah, first I want to say I was surprised by how many incredible questions came in. It was very well thought out, and I was very impressed. And so it was difficult for me to figure out how to address as many of them as I could. So let me try to reduce it to these 4 topics. And the first one is going to be for Graham. There was one question that addressed, I guess, this thing that Peter Eisenmann said at a talk recently, where you're either a formalist or a phenomenologist. Pick. You got to pick one. There's no in between, right? So I guess first we got to talk a little bit about what is formalism and what is phenomenology. I think the question, the way it was asked, that was suggesting maybe there's a third way, you know, an in-between way. So I'm kind of curious to know what Graham thinks of that too, if there is a possible synthesis here, which I'm not sure there is either. Yeah.
I'm going to explain why I think Eisenmann is wrong in offering that alternative. First, I want to say that I have a lot of time for Eisenmann and his writings. He's one of the serious theorists of the last half century, and I've learned immeasurably from reading his works and his way of wrestling with various philosophers, especially Derrida. First of all, we have to define what formalism means. And sometimes it's used to mean the mathematical formalization of something, so that you're turning something into a model or an equation. That's not really the primary sense. The primary sense of formalism comes from Kant, and it can be explained pretty quickly. Formalism is a concept Kant first invented in his Ethics. Kant calls himself a formalist in ethics. What does that mean? Well, for Kant, an act is not ethical if it is done for some external purpose. It has to be done for its own sake. So if you're doing something because you want to go to heaven, or you're afraid of going to hell, or if you're doing something nice because you want to have a good reputation in the community, or be praised by your parents, or any other motivation, that's fine. It might be socially beneficial, but it's not really ethical. Kant has this whole ethical theory with different variants on it, but what it all comes down to is that an ethical act is done for its own sake. It's done purely out of duty, regardless of the consequences. Now, Kant doesn't really use the term formalism in his aesthetic theory, but it's there. Because what is an artwork for Kant? Well, first of all, it's not beautiful just because it's agreeable to me, right? That in itself does not make it a good artwork. So the example I use is the movie Field of Dreams. Some of you may have seen it. It's a baseball movie about Iowa. I happen to be from Iowa, and so it's nice for me that Iowa is actually the subject of a film, right? So I enjoy it every time I know that town where the baseball field is. Makes me feel flattered to be an Iowan and watch that movie. That doesn't mean the movie is a good movie just because it's agreeable to me. It's not a classic of cinema or anything, right? So it can't be agreeable. Also, formalism in art means that you cannot replace an artwork with a prose description of its meaning. So you cannot say Picasso's painting Guernica was a protest against the violence of German intervention in the Spanish Civil War. That's part of it, but the aesthetic effect of the painting cannot be exhausted by a prose description. You cannot paraphrase an artwork. It's something that has to be judged by taste, right? Not by some explanation of its meaning. It can't be that an artwork is good because you like its political meaning, or bad because you dislike its political meaning. So those are some of the things that formalism means in art. But what it really comes down to is that an artwork is supposed to be non-relational. It's supposed to be cut off. Formalism in literary criticism means you don't care about the social political content of the work. You don't care about the biography of the author. You're simply judging the internal textual qualities of the work. That's in literary criticism. Now here's the problem with Kant's definition of formalism. Kant spoils it. Kant spoils it by saying the real thing you have to do is exclude the interaction of human and work, right? Because what you're doing is you're getting rid of the human agreeableness of the work, or you're getting rid of the human conceptuality of the work. The work and the human should be separate. That is the key non-relational structure at work for Kant. You can never have the human and the work interact. Now, ironically, for Kant, it's the human side that's important, because Kant thinks we all have the same universal structure of judgment that we share, and whatever in the work is simply calling the attention to what we have in our minds as humans. That is flipped around by the formalist art critics of the 20th century, like Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried, who put the attention back on the objects, right? Fried, for example, thinks it's theatrical if a painting appeals to its beholder too much. So early in his career, he likes all these paintings where we seem to be excluded from the painting, where the characters in the painting seem to be absorbed in what they're doing and paying no attention to us, or where a desk drawer is pushed out as if to exclude us from the painting. So for him, theatricality is the enemy, and that's why he doesn't like 1960s and post-1960s art. He thinks it's too theatrical. Fried later changes his mind. Fried later sees from his work on Courbet and Manet that their paintings always face us directly and confront us and challenge us. So he kind of changes his opinion. Now, turning to architecture, Eisenmann is very much on the side of the early Fried. Eisenmann talks about self-contained objecthood of the architectural object. He is opposed to what he calls humanism in architecture, which for him starts in the Renaissance and goes all the way up to much of what we call modernist architecture in the 20th century, in the form of functionalism, because functionalism is just another way for the object to serve humans, he says. What he wants is a self-contained object. This leads him to what I see as a number of errors. One of them is that he thinks the architectural object shouldn't be interacting with the human at all. It would be a kind of theatricality, it would be a humanism that he dislikes. That's Derrida's agenda, to exclude humanism. I don't see a problem with humanism. I think architecture needs a human ingredient, just like art needs a human ingredient, just like chess or basketball has humans or ingredients. You wouldn't ask for a chess without humans or a basketball without humans. Why would you ask for an art or an architecture without humans? Humans are an ingredient. The important thing for me is that humans are not privileged observers, that the artwork or the architectural work has a depth that is not exhaustible by the human observer. There's something there that we cannot master. but we are still ingredients nonetheless. That the artwork or the architectural work has to have us involved as an ingredient to the work. There's another problem with Eisenman. I actually was just writing a chapter about Eisenman for my book, and I distinguish between what I call reverent. Medium Eisenman just says, functionalists always wanted the function of the building to be expressed in its form. That somehow a column should look like a column. It should look like it's supporting things, and he argues against that. I call that medium Eisenman because I can see his point. You might want to de-emphasize that a bit more for some reason. But then there's spicy Eisenman, which is where he actively subverts the functionality of his buildings. So for example, in House 3, where you have these columns all over the living and eating area that make it very hard to live and eat. And he says, well, you know, it leads to these unexpected encounters and unexpected changes in lifestyle, or putting the column in the middle of the bed does that too. But there's a problem with this, which is that it takes away architecture's ability to become a medium, right? It turns all architecture into a facade, into something visible and legible that we have to confront directly. The interior becomes a facade, whereas that's subverting the fact that architecture can also be a tacit medium that doesn't make an explicit statement about what reality is, but that sets up a reality in which we unconsciously inhabit. And there's that side of architecture too. Architecture is a medium that Eisenman actively tries to subvert, and I think that's a problem. Now, if you compare Eisenman with the architectural phenomenologists, who he basically loathes, there's something interesting going on there, because on the one hand, I'm not as against those people as some of my friends are. I don't have a problem with paying attention to what it sounds like in a building, or what the temperature in the room feels like, or the fact that you see rooms in a sequence. It's not just a visual image, but it's this temporal experience that you're weaving together with memory. I think all of these are perfectly valid insights among the phenomenologists. The problem is, that's only one side of Heidegger that they're drawing on, the fact that humans have this experience of being thrown into the world. There is also the fact that being is inaccessible for Heidegger. It's unparaphrasable. It's something that can never be directly visible. And so maybe there's too much focus on sensual immediacy in architectural phenomenology, and it's not something I would ever want to follow. I just think that when Eisenman treats that as his enemy, as he does when opposing himself to phenomenology, as though that's his big enemy, it's showing too much of a Derridian agenda that he doesn't necessarily need to follow with. This idea that you need to get rid of humanism, as though subtracting humans from the picture somehow solves the problems of modernism. It doesn't. In fact, it almost does the opposite. If you say that humans are the big problem, you're almost giving humans too much power, the way that modernism did, just in a negative sense. Let me give you an analogy. I had some European friends back in the 90s, basically this, just dinner with an American leftist woman from San Francisco, and they were completely sick of her. And it's interesting why. The reason they were sick of her is her entire dinner conversation for a whole hour was about all these evil things the CIA is doing around the world, and that every bad thing that happens in the world, the CIA is somehow responsible for doing it. She's an American leftist. And their criticism of her was very interesting. They imitated her as saying, America must at least be the worst. If it's not the best, then it must be the worst. And strangely, that's a kind of perverse form of patriotism. That America is so powerful that it either must be the best, and American exceptionalism, we're the best country, we have the best economic and political system, or if it's not that, then it must be the worst. We must be destroying everything in the world. What both of those attitudes have in common is that ultimately America is just another country with its strengths and weaknesses just like any other country. And I would say the same thing about human beings, that human beings are not this uniquely poisonous agent that can come in and destroy formalism just by looking at a building, so that we need to make the architecture completely self-contained and destroy any humanism by getting rid of the functions. No, you need the functions there as a kind of practical medium in which activities can occur. I don't want columns running down through my bed or through my dining room, because I don't want to think about those columns, right? I want that in the background, just like Zizek says. Zizek admits that even though he's a Marxist, he doesn't want to be thinking about water policy all the time. He wants politics to be in the background, as it is in bourgeois society. Take care of that most of the time. We don't want an entirely politicized living space, and I don't want an entirely defunctionalized living space for that reason. So I would say, instead of Eisenman's opposition between formalism and phenomenology, I would say there's a difference between formalism and relationism. And for me, what relationism means I have nothing against the building relating to its environment. It's just that that relation usually occurs with only a few points in the environment, and we select those very carefully. So if someone says their building is site-specific, and of course architecture is more site-specific than visual art as a rule, because you're building it in a specific site and it's not going to move most of the time. You're not dealing with all aspects of the site. You're choosing 4 or 5 or 6 things about the site that the building is responding to or emphasizing or accentuating. Whereas what you get with relationism is this idea of holism, that everything blends together with everything else and there are no boundaries. And in Patrick Schumacher's case, the building has to blend right into the environment, which you were criticizing, David. You can't distinguish between the building and what's around it. You can't articulate the parts inside the building. You don't even know where to put the doors and the windows because that disrupts the continuity of the flow of the building. No, I think you need to make a decision and articulate, and I think you need to decide to exclude certain things. To mention Schumacher again, he talks about how cities are basically systems of relations. No, they're not. Cities are also systems of closing off spaces from other spaces. You don't want the noise from the city in your office room. You don't want the sauna that you're in to be visible to people on the sidewalk, right? It's a way of choosing certain communications and choosing certain non-communications and articulating that relationship. So relationism for me is simply a lazy way of saying, hey, everything's connected with everything else. The world is a cosmic whole. No, where thought comes in is deciding what relates and what does not relate and creating barriers to certain relations that you want to exclude. So that's why I oppose formalism to relationism rather than to phenomenology. I think there's a space for phenomenology within formalism.
We may need some new words too.
Yeah.
Yeah. The amazing thing about my friend Graham is every time I ever hear him talk, I learn something. It's really amazing. Thank you.
That's because I'm trying to learn something between our conversations every time. Because I realize I don't know enough architecture yet, so I keep going and learning more between each of our conversations.
Well, the next question then it's, I guess, more for Ferda and Michael. I guess question becomes, what is the impact on practice after all of this, after 10 years of thinking and talking about this? How's this affected what the two of you think a building is? Maybe first you, Michael, because you're just in the middle of finishing your first serious work in Mexico City. And there are some odd features to that building. And I'd like to know how this has all influenced your approach to this very real building in Mexico City.
Sure. So we're just about to, well, it was just about to finish a couple of months ago. Construction's been stopped, as it's been stopped everywhere in the world. But it's almost there, so it'll pick up soon. But the 9-unit apartment building in Mexico City. And to describe it verbally, without images, it's essentially a kind of concrete box, board-formed concrete, very raw, very rough. And it maximizes its entire footprint to its site. And the way in which we made the argument to the developer that we could do this is that we would have windows on all sides, but the windows would rotate into the building so that each space would have an oblique view out from it. So you wouldn't be looking directly against your neighbor. Instead, you'd see the view beyond, the street across the way, the landscape, and you'd have all of these different oblique views. Now, it does some very strange things. And this, to me, is not, I would never claim that we have tried to design a OOO building. Again, this goes back to the earlier conversation, the earlier point. But one of the ways in which OOO becomes interesting in architecture is this question of estrangement, in which issues, indoor elements, indoor things that we deal with as architects, as the ordinary, as the background, as the everyday, begin to become strange. And for us, these windows do that. And they do that in two ways. One, by rotating into the building, they create a facade that begins to kind of vibrate and softly fluctuate like a bas-relief. And so something that is very raw, very straight, very pure, ends up kind of having a soft, subtle inflection, as if it is animate in a kind of subtle way by the windows pulling in and out smoothly from the building. Now, all of that leads to very strange and disjunctive moments inside the building, where the windows now pull your eyes apart and start to split your vision into opposite directions. So that when you're in a space, you're never in a space looking out framed, which is the traditional architectural window descended from the Renaissance, nor are you in the modernist or Corbusian scanned window, but instead you're in a window that is bifurcating views simultaneously. You're always seeing more than one view. You can never be in one spot looking out to one framed piece of nature. Nature is always pulling you in separate directions. And that kind of relationship between interiority, exteriority, what a window frames, what a window positions within the observer, I call a very strange experience. And to me, it's done with one of the most ordinary elements we use in architecture, which is the window.
Michael, can I ask a question? I'm
Sure.
looking at an image of this building right now and loving it. What would you say to somebody who said, oh, estrangement, that's deconstructivism?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question, but I would say that the estrangement that we're producing is through the aesthetic experience and not through the linguistic semantics. That we're not trying to take the way in which one would interpret window. A deconstructivist window would play with the window as a sign system. It would take it as something that signifies here is interiority, here is scale, here is aperture as it's related to the proportions of this architecture here, because the window, it can be understood within deconstruction as a kind of denotative linguistic element. We're not interested in that. We're not interested in subverting those readings. Much more about close attention than close reading. To go back to another formalist, the new criticism would always be talking about the close reading that was revealing the internal structure. This is much more about attention, in ways in which attention is disturbed, shifted, intensified, diffused. We're as interested in things that diffuse attention as we are in things that attract attention, and not for the interpretation of new meanings, but for the altering of assumed experience.
Yeah, I think we're going to touch on this again in the next questions, but I just want to put a spotlight on just this effect that maybe this conversation we've been having with Graham for 10 years has had on us. I also have found myself looking much more closely at the most mundane details of buildings. Things that I never would have paid attention to, I'm now paying attention to. And I'm going to use that as a transition to Ferda. Earlier, before we started, we were talking about this project Ferda did. There are other buildings Ferda has done, and more fully formed buildings, but in particular, this one gallery installation at SCI-Arc, I think astonished everybody when they saw it. And in the end, it was a column that you had designed. Probably the most scrutinized, most hyper attentive, the most tortured focus on a simple column. So I wonder, maybe you could speak a little bit about that and maybe how that relates to the other built work you're doing.
Yeah, I think before I get into describing the column a little more closely, I want to say that one of the larger questions to me that were shifted through OOO is to look at architecture maybe no longer based on components and wholes, which is, you know, the kind of very obvious, again, long disciplinary way of thinking of architecture, right? I mean, how do components come together? You know, what is their relationship? What's the relationship to the whole? Obviously, Alberti plays a big role, but you know, in every era, you can actually write about a very specific shift in the paradigm based on the relationship of the parts to whole or componentry, including parametricism, right, where the whole is completely governed by the components. And I'm interested in actually thinking no longer in terms of wholes and parts, but everything is an object. Everything from the small to the large is an object, and therefore it has at least potentials or potentialities that go beyond it being subservient to the idea of a whole, which is a full abstraction, right? I mean, it's sort of an abstract idea where the parts then come together and to create it. To me, it was a really helpful way of leaving that behind. And now I'm coming to the column and just think, well, what would it take to design a former component of architecture, the column, maybe one of the most scrutinized, most important architectural components, if that becomes the object itself, the thing itself, but it still is reminiscent that come from the column. And just to quickly describe it, it's basically made from two distinct parts. One is the base, which is aluminum extrusions that are being put together and sliced off in particular ways to create patterns that show the webbing inside the extrusion. And then there's a capital in a very sort of classical Greek order from the base to the shaft to the capital, which is a powder print top, which looks like marble. It's marbleized and plays with the ideas we already discussed today between the real and the fictitious or the fake. It was really important to us that the top, the capital, looks like marble, but is not marble, but powder. It's a particle-based, glue-based system. And the two of them come together and create the overall column. Now the relationship between, let's say, the extrusions mimicking to a certain degree, and again, if you Google and find the image, you'll have a much better idea what I'm talking about, but there's something in the mundane quality of the aluminum extrusion, which of course in modernism was the epitome of the idea of standardization. Right? It couldn't get cheaper, it couldn't get more standardized than an aluminum extrusion or any really kind of extrusion. To take that and make it special, quote unquote, to me was a way of tapping into its hidden object quality, or maybe a way of alluding to something that is existing in the conglomeration of a bunch of extrusions. Again, of course, it's not one, it's many extrusions put together and then sliced in ways that we can see interesting patterns occur. So this act of slicing to me was a way of, yeah, sort of alluding to a quality within the mundane that is actually extraordinary, almost special. And that kind of relationship then goes all the way up to the top, where there is an inversion, where the kind of, you know, realness of the marble is actually giving way to just being a powdered, completely abstract, technologically, digitally produced architecture. So in a way, to me, practice is exactly that. It's a kind of continuous questioning and investigation what the pieces are that we use, what it means to work with components and relationships, what it means to use matter. What is the difference? Why do we valorize marble versus powder or aluminum extrusions? We already said, I think David said it in the beginning, I mean, reality is just really a kind of a contract. It's just like us coming together and saying, well, that's reality, we shake hands on it. But at any time, to me, our role as architects is to, yeah, poke holes into that. And to me, the column does that. I have other projects, or we have projects also in my teaching where we're trying to widen that conversation or that way of working to buildings and even urban schemes. But I think I'd like to leave it at this. I mean, that's where I see you know, a real potentiality or possibility for practice to take on some of these ideas.
So just to add to this, so one of the important insights from Graham's work for me is just the very basic, I guess, conclusion that everything that exists is always going to be more than any summary or list of qualities you can name. So for example, this is a very basic thing we know really well about people. So for example, I've known my friend Ferda Kolatan for nearly 30 years. And you would think after 30 years, I should be able to give you a pretty good summary if you've never met him. So tell me about Ferda. Maybe I'm trying to set him up on a date. Tell me about this guy, Ferda. Okay, Ferda is like this, he's like this, he's like this, he's like this. I'm sure a list of 10 qualities just won't do it. When they finally meet Ferda, they'll go, oh, he's nothing like what I imagined from the list you gave me. Oh, maybe the list should have been bigger. All right, next time I make a list of 100 things, same thing happens. Maybe I should make a list with 1,000 qualities. Probably same thing will happen. How many things do I actually need to list in order to have a complete picture of Ferda? Probably it's inexhaustible. After 30 years of knowing him, I know Ferda is fully capable of utterly surprising me with some strange thing he's done. From knowing him for 30 years, I have no idea what his next project's going to be. So we know this about people. You may be married to the same person for 50 years, and one day they do something that astonishes you. It's like, oh my God, I have no idea who this person is. This we know about people. Why don't we think this about anything else? I think great buildings are like this. I don't know how many times I've been to La Tourette. Every time I go there, I see new things. I notice new things. The last time Ferda and I went to Ranchamp, I noticed this bizarre window where this little statue of the Virgin Mary was put on the exterior looking in, but from an oblique. I'd never noticed that before. I've never even seen that in a book either. You know? So I think great works are like this. Every time I read Hamlet, I see something else. Hamlet, I think, Graham, you pointed this out, in the 19th century, that's when he was recognized as a great writer. Like in the 18th century, people didn't realize how good Shakespeare was. You know? So there is always this reserve, this kind of hidden reserve in everything that exists, which leads one to know that everything that exists can be more than what we think it can be. So whether it's a column or a window, door, a concrete slab, and maybe there are a lot of things we haven't even thought of yet that could even be considered objects in a building. So I think this is fundamentally related to this question of reality and being too kind of basic with our expectations from the world. And I think maybe something you can take out of this as you return to your architecture practice, maybe get a little bit more ambitious and aggressive about what you think architecture can do. That maybe it could do a lot more than you think it can. You know? And maybe there is no methodology beyond paying a lot more attention than maybe you did before. And just maybe letting go of some of the ideas that you're working with in this kind of idea of what you think it should be, because it can always be more than that. Okay, so I guess that maybe brings us neatly to the third point here. That was a great question. It's a really good question. Well, it looks, and I'm kind of paraphrasing now. Object-oriented architecture, it looks like in the first 10 years, I've produced a lot of weird-looking buildings. And isn't this a problem? If it gets too weird, no one will know what this is and how to even react to it. And isn't that bad, like culturally, if you make these things that no one knows what the hell it is, right? So I guess it's an opportunity for me to clarify a little bit. I'm not interested in that kind of weirdness or strangeness at all, because I think this is the kind of weirdness of really bad, like monster movies. So like you watch certain horror movies and they're not at all scary. In fact, they're hilarious. Why? Because we've seen that same monster over and over and over again. It's the same monster over and over again. It's the same weird that we've seen before. So it's actually not weird at all. I find the most terrifying movies are movies like The Exorcist, where most of the movie, 99% of that movie is completely normal and banal. And then there are these crazy scenes that are utterly bizarre. And it's absolutely terrifying because most of the movie is just so normal, you know. So much better idea of the weirdness we might be interested in. That I'm particularly interested in how these ideas have affected a group of young architects in Tokyo, where you would look at their built work and you almost don't even notice anything. It just seems completely bland. And then you realize that there's some things that are a little bit weird about it. Some things are a little off, and it completely draws you in. Some things look like it wasn't finished being built. Other things look like somebody did a really bad paint job. There are many compositional strategies here to induce this kind of crack in the armor where you see some other reality peeking through. So I would advocate for a kind of O influence architecture that is mostly normal, with some key elements that are a little bit strange, that draws you in and leads to one, maybe it just opens up other possible realities for us. Yeah. What do you think of that, Graham? Does that sound okay to you? Does that sound interesting?
And as much as I like surrealism, one of the problems with surrealism is it just kind of postulates all these weird forms, but the reality isn't there. It's like Ballard's complaints. It's creating too many fictions, not enough reality. So you need a strong base of banal reality. Aristotle said something about this. Aristotle said that metaphorical statements should only be occasional. If every term in a sentence is metaphorical, you end up with a riddle. He gives that example of, I saw a man glue bronze on a man with fire. Like, what the hell is that? Right? You need a basically literal statement that has one deformed moment of non-literalism. So yes.
How about you, Michael? It sounds like you're kind of down with that, with how you approached your building in Mexico City.
Yeah, no, that's, I think the work of Jung and Ayala is intimately tied to that as much work as we put into the moments that are strange, there's more work put into the moments which people don't notice, which may be even normal. And like, for instance, to use a filmmaker too, I always talk about David Lynch in this conversation. And David Lynch often gets called surreal. He's not a surrealist. Only his most extreme moments have anything to do with any kind of possible surrealism. He spends so much time getting normal, just trying to get normal. And often the kinds of frictions and fractures that occur within the extreme normalcy of the worlds that he's creating end up making the whole thing feel strange. I don't know if people have watched Twin Peaks, but Twin Peaks is a perfect example of this to me. Each of those characters is incredibly weird because each of those characters is actually incredibly particular, described whole in their identity. The whole world is normal, and within that normalcy, each of these people ends up becoming a strange problem for another character in the movie. Each of the places becomes a strange problem for those characters in the movie. Take any of these things out and put them separately, it's a normal world. Put them all together and put them into friction with each other, in the episodes, the kind of frictions, the sparks that are created, incredibly strange. And I think this is also something that is not strange as something that is exhausted. There's styles that can be exhausted. There's tropes that can be exhausted. In fact, when things become overused, and we use these words like styles and tropes, we're putting exactly a finger on that moment of fatigue. But the kinds of frictional relations that are made between these different situations in a film by David Lynch continually gives you strangeness the time again and again and again that you enter into those worlds.
You know, David, can I add something quickly?
Of course.
I mean, the question about the strange is an interesting one, and we've been dealing with it in many different ways. And it's also not a surprise that a lot of us share a liking for certain filmmakers and architects and artists when it comes to that question, because to me, in the end, it ends up being also a question of certain aesthetic sensibility. It seems we're drawn toward a certain expression that begins to either, as Michael said, and Graham writes about, a tension of some sort, or it alienates you from the things that you believe you know, and therefore you kind of come and revisit the thing over and over and begin to find new ways of looking at it, as you were describing Hamlet. To me, it, in the end, as a designer, kind of comes down to how we actually produce a certain set of effects that widen or go beyond the ones that, you know, are the kinds of tropes we're talking about. And therefore, I'm personally always, you know, a little bit hesitant to use a word like strange, or I'm doing it. And then I also come to the realization that it's a little bit of a placeholder, because we lack a different kind of language to be more clear about what that even means. I find it, for instance, interesting when I think about surrealism. I don't think all of it is on the level of you know, the monster. One of my favorite artists in surrealism is Max Ernst, and he has done a whole series of graphic works where he was just cutting out the most mundane picture books and drawing books and reassembling them into new kinds of narratives. I mean, I've been, for instance, always fascinated about that kind of approach to the production of art or even architecture, that there is some relationship of meaning that is being altered and, I guess, estranged, right? But that's very different than, let's say, Salvador Dali, you know, his work, where I would say, yeah, that is probably everything becomes sort of absorbed by a certain totalizing effect of the strange or the monster. But Max Ernst's work, I would put into a totally different kind of category, much more related to, you know, what I think, you know, at least I'm trying to do, I'm interested in as an artistic practice.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the criticisms of maybe what I just said about 99% normal, 1% weird, is like a crack of another possible reality is shining through what looks generally pretty normal and familiar. It might be seen as kind of a transition moment where we first have to operate on the reality as given, and we're trying to pry it open a little bit for other possible realities to be coming through it. And it might be that it is a kind of transition strategy where we're still in a kind of period of late modernism, as I see it. And there might have to be some work that we have to do to get to the next period of history. And I know, Ferda, you're always a little bit hesitant to accept a kind of critical strategy where we're just kind of operating on what we have for a while, because we are eager to be in the next place. You know? But I think that might be just where we're at right now, where we might still need to work through the last vestiges of modernity, still, which is still with us, even though our society is really beyond modernism now. I mean, we know this, but still all of our conventional practices rely upon the conventions of modernity, and we can't suddenly leave it as well. So I think, I guess I'm espousing maybe a more modest step towards the next place. Yeah. Maybe it's, just this is more for the students of architecture here that are with us. I see this in my students. I think maybe this is just what it's like to be new to a field in any culture, where you're trying to figure out what's going on. In the United States, there's this term "cool hunting." Like you become a cool hunter. Like what's the cool thing to do now? And I think this is a kind of an interesting attitude one might have to the present moment, where the present moment or the present reality is something you feel like you have to chase. That I don't know what it is exactly, so I need to know what is the thing to do now. That's probably why you're here. You heard about OOO and you're curious. So could this be the cool thing to do now, right? And I hope from a point of view where maybe this isn't just the latest dress to put on, the latest thing to buy, but maybe this is maybe a different way of thinking, and a different way, and like all new ways of thinking, it suggests new ways of practicing too. So instead of chasing reality, maybe spend more time making it, I guess would be my advice. So maybe that brings me to the last part, and maybe this is to lead with Graham. There was an interesting question from Professor Bu, I believe. And the question was about authorship and collaboration. I spent some time recently doing more of a basic scholarship on the history of copyrights and the history of how the legal systems of Europe and the United States defined what an author is. I think this is probably, I know, in fact, authors exist still, even though Roland Barthes wrote an essay called The Death of the Author. The author is alive and well insofar as copyright law still exists, because authors are entitled to intellectual property, which can be defended in a court of law. In architecture, copyright legislation has been infamously difficult to defend. And there are some fascinating court cases in the United States where there are instances of apparent copyright infringement that were unresolved. And the United States legal system finds the architectural work to be one of the most difficult things to understand legally. So I think there's something fundamentally multi-authored with architecture, while at the same time, architecture probably has the longest historical mythology of the single genius. So I think one of the things that maybe is a sub-project of object-oriented ontology, and it's too bad Tim Morton's not here, because I know he would have a lot to say about this. But maybe with, as we move into more seriousness about the era of climate change, where it's getting pretty existential, I don't know how much longer we can ignore this, I think maybe some of these mythologies of the genius or the romantic subject, and then our position relative to the sublime world, which I think is tied to this problem of the author, ultimately, are actual obstructions to dealing with the problems we have now. So I think it remains to be seen if we could maybe, I guess, I'm very curious if maybe there's something beyond our current established legal and economic norms of intellectual property, something that could suggest something more collaborative, something maybe that could be a little bit more object-oriented in how we engage what we call the real economy. So I'm wondering, Graham, I know you've had similar conferences in the past where you've spoken to economists and to, I would guess at some point you have spoken to legal scholars too. I'm curious, how does object-oriented ontology suggest other possible practices moving forward?
All right. I have a couple of thoughts about this. The first one is that the debate often comes down to one of individuals versus collectives. So the one side will say individual geniuses are responsible for everything, and then the other side will say, no, you have to understand the context of Elizabethan England that allowed Shakespeare to write his plays. Or a debate over whether Thomas Jefferson deserves to be called the author of the Declaration of Independence, or whether you have to look at all the people who gave critical feedback. And the right tends to be associated politically with the individualism, and the left tends to be associated with collective cooperation. Whereas my position on this is oftentimes it's the object that is interesting, right? The object of the Declaration of Independence itself guides, as it takes shape, guides the behavior of individuals and collectives. One way this plays out in intellectual history, of course, is configurations of people, right? So why is it that, for example, at least in Western civilization, when you get great figures in a field, like say in music or philosophy, they tend to come in clusters. They don't tend to appear individually. You tend to see Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel at one time. You tend to see Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven in quick succession. You have, in atonal music, you have Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. Why is it that you get these clusters of people? It can't just be that three incredibly smart individuals happen to be born in the same time and place. It's that there's an object there, and certain people are called to address that object, which they do in different ways. Looks like David is frozen. I don't know if he's vanished, but I will keep answering the question. So I am interested in the object as the chief protagonist of history, and humans simply as responding to possible permutations of the object. There you are. You're back.
Sorry, I'm just moving.
Okay, well, I'll keep talking and hope you can hear. I just finished writing an article about Alain Badiou's discussion of configurations in musical history. It's an idea he got from Charles Rosen's book, The Classical Style, dating from way back in 1970, where Rosen has this wonderful book about how exactly Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven differ both from the Baroque before them and from the Romantic after them. And what is it that makes a style classical? For him, it has to do with a certain drama, which he calls the sonata form. The fact that you're accentuating drama using tonal structure to lead to a certain culmination, whereas Baroque and Romantic both do things very differently. And so that for me points to a sense in which the individual is not as primary as the object that they are trying to deal with in a different permutation compared to those of their contemporaries. On the other hand, thank you. I've also been thinking about this in a political sense. If object-oriented politics is important, the one book I wrote about politics, I was talking about how there are two problems with modern political theory. One of them is that it has to do too much with human nature, right? Modern political theory is always in a debate about the state of nature. Were humans good or evil by nature? And in a way, that's only important if you assume that humans are the basic ingredient of politics. Whereas, as Bruno Latour argues, most of the stability in our political life is created by objects, right? So unlike a baboon, when you wake up in the morning, you have a pretty good idea of what your identity is, right? Except maybe in rare cases of civil unrest or personal unrest, you know what your social position is, you know your name, you either have a wedding ring on or you don't. You have a driver's license, you have a social security number in America, a bank account, you know how much money you have. It's all these inanimate objects that stabilize our social society, right? So that's one problem. The other problem with modern political theory is that it aims at political knowledge, which is precisely what the political is not. We don't really know what works and what doesn't work. It's a constant experimentation, and we're constantly threatened by chaos. Now, I think in the case of the coronavirus, we have a clear case of an inanimate actor that has disrupted the political sphere, and it's being opposed very feebly in the United States by this kind of individualism, right? Hey, I'm free. You're obstructing my freedom. I can go shopping or I can go walking without a mask, because we have this strong sense of individualism as the center of the American political system. I had always assumed that everybody knew that public health was an exception to this, right? That if there were an epidemic, a pandemic, you would have to curtail some of your behavior. But apparently not. We're seeing people who are doubling down on individualism, on the individual as being the basic unit of politics. Margaret Thatcher saying society doesn't exist. There are only individuals and at most families. So obviously, there are collectives that we need to take into account, public health being one of them, but there are also all these other non-human entities, such as the ozone hole, such as global warming, such as specific kinds of moss or rocks that engage in weathering processes related to CO2 in the atmosphere. So I think we do need to shift the focus away from the individual politically and aesthetically, but also not necessarily towards the human collective, because the human collective is also a false human solution in a way. Those are some of my first thoughts to your question, David.
That's fascinating. I think everything you just said, I think it strikes me, it runs in parallel to maybe the actors I play in the production of a building, for example. There is the individual, that is the architect, and then there is also the collective, which might be the whole office, but also including the people who are building it, and not to mention the people inhabiting it or the city itself. So there is both this question of the individual and the collective in architecture as well. Maybe this is also missing from the politics of the building, just like there might be something missing in the politics of the general economy that maybe we need to also take into consideration the non-human actors that are part of the building. That is the resources, that is the weather, that is the structural strain. There are probably an infinite number of things that we can include or choose, as you said, to exclude from the conversation. So I think to formulate such a politics of the building itself, just as urgently as maybe for our general politics, that maybe there are things beyond the dichotomy of the individual and the collective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Architecture.
So I'm sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Architecture is necessarily political at a different level from philosophy. Michael just talked about how they stopped construction on his project because of the virus. That doesn't happen to me. They're still producing my books as we speak because all they need is desktop publishing software and put something on a computer file somewhere. Nothing stops in the philosophy publishing world. It's moving at the normal speed. In fact, it's moving faster because we're all. Also, architects need certain social skills that philosophers do not. One of our colleagues who's building a project in Los Angeles as we speak, you may remember, had to spend up to a year dealing with a hostile mayor and a rival who was trying to stab him in the back, and he had to go and make these elegant speeches at the city council meeting. It's not something philosophers usually have to worry about. Even granted, there's a lot more paper architecture that's relevant than I thought before I got into the fields. Many of the major projects were never built. You still are involved politically and in collectives in a way that philosophers are able to isolate themselves from. So you guys are more close.
Michael, just in the problem of making a custom window, probably something that had to be made from scratch, probably something I imagine no contractor wanted to build. You had to engage in quite a bit of politics. And it's not just about that type of politics, but it's also the politics of you with the material and making that part of the interaction of the various actors that had to come together. Like the window, in other words, had something to say about this, I think.
Yeah, without a doubt. And there's also within any construction, there's these stories that happen. Like, for instance, the government in Mexico changed, which meant that the variance that we had applied for got revoked, which meant that the project had to go on hold, which meant that the construction system that we had developed for the window 5 years ago could be prototyped in a different construction system, and it got way better. And all of that is you know, those are contingencies that we deal with as architects. But within that is an argument between a construction system, a construction material, a culture of construction, the politics of who's running the country and who's not, and the zoning ordinances that they use to control the ways in which the city develops. And then ultimately there's a model. And that model is the prototype of us trying to test what is this going to do. And it's a negotiation. It's a negotiation between multiple different parties, multiple different actors, multiple different objects, some of them human, some of them non-human.
You know, all the people that have had a hand in getting this stuff built here, the more experienced among us, you all know this. This is daily experience, the daily complexity of architecture, which maybe some of our students may not know about. And this is something that we have known in architecture. We typically say, well, you really have no idea what you're doing until you actually start working and get some experience. But what is that? What happens when you are getting that experience? It is this, a kind of daily, nonstop encounter with all the unbelievable complexity of human and non-human actors that have to be brought together. And maybe the thing that's been missing is a kind of theory about this, which is why this kind of thing can't be taught in school, because all we have are methodologies and manifestos and formalisms in the old sense. So maybe this might offer a way to theorize this in a more explicit way. And maybe we can move beyond some of the ways in which we've been relying on certain ways of thinking about architecture and connected maybe more to the actual reality of architecture. And because the reality itself is quite strange already, and much stranger than any theory suggests. You know? So instead of continuing to think that the daily strangeness of what has to come together to make great architecture is not a form of cheating or an anomaly or messiness, but that this is actually the way to do it, that this is the right way. And it's just that we may lack a kind of viable theory that explains why it is this way. So because of my enormous respect for you, my friend Ferda, I'm gonna just give you the last word here. And so it doesn't even have to be related to this final question about author and multi-author or human and non-human actors. But what do you think of all of this?
I mean, it's what strike me in this context, and then the last context you're talking about, David, is what Graham said a little earlier when he was describing that why do we have suddenly a number of super achieving personalities come to the fore, you know, in music, in art, in all kinds of creative fields, and well, that there is actually an object that's in there, and it sort of spawns in some kind of orbital way these people and collaboratives that sort of become one with the object, or the object is relating to them and back. And I think that's such a, for me, a strong image when it comes to also the practice of architecture, where the architecture in a way is that object, right? And then to me, from there, it sort of does all the things that we have been talking about, ways of breaking it down into further objects. But there's an understanding that each one of the constituents of the object of architecture, human, non-human, mundane, special, legal, non-legal, all of them are constantly re-articulating their collaborative actions with each other. And to me, that's a really kind of powerful image. You know, some of you guys know that I'm really interested also in some of the work of Donna Haraway and her coinage of the notion of Odkin, which clearly is related in many ways to the discussions that we've been having. To me, it sort of is the, it's related to the strange and weird question, but it's more particular in the sense that it sort of invites us or encourages us to understand that the world is filled with objects that are in odd relationships to each other already. And only through understanding that and forging new kinds of kinships within these oddities can we sort of, you know, go to the next level. And that to me, again, that sort of goes from the aesthetic where it's kind of sitting because it's a realist project, it's a material project, but it also obviously includes questions of politics and even ethics. And, you know, bringing it back to the question of the world we occupy right now, and I'm not even talking so much about the coronavirus, but the sort of ecological issues that we're all facing. It's too bad that Tim wasn't be able to join us. But it ties into that question too, because we use materials that, you know, do off-gassing. We use constantly material and immaterial qualities when we act as architects. And yet, here to me is the big difference. In quote unquote the modern world, we had a set of categories that seemingly allowed us to work from you know, a point of security where we believed we know certain things and we can handle or address problems through a way of thinking in categories. Architecture is a prime example. We all know we still work with a set of plans. In America, we start with schematic design, design development, construction drawings, etc., which has nothing to do with the way how a building is being produced. It has nothing to do with how a building is being designed and conceptualized. It's a complete sort of categorical template. And I think what these templates have started to do is they don't work anymore. And they're too restrictive. And this brings me back to the whole question of what did OOO do for you? For me, it did also something very important, which it made me understand that the kind of value that we were putting into these kinds of categories and templates really no longer, you know, have meaning in the world we occupy today, right? And that has to do with the problem of image proliferation, has to do with the problem of hyperobject, has to do with the problem, you know, that the environment and so forth. So I think, to me, this is just such a big question that we're all facing. We can do it through the lens of architecture. And I think I'm, you know, for one, since this is a conference or a talk about sort of the 10 years or almost decade of architectural engagement with ideas of OOO, to me, the freshness of the problem is that we can continuously keep developing it, right? And I think the next generation, which is you guys listening in, will have very different set of problems and solutions. And I still believe because OOO is not a stylistic formal quality, or at least not only, you will be able to instrumentalize it in new and different kinds of ways.
So it is, we are now almost 30 minutes past promise. And I want to thank my friends here for staying a little bit longer and also for coming early. And thanks to all of you for paying attention to us while we're talking. It's always great to meet a new audience. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Yiqun to say goodbye and close this up. But I just want to say, remind you of something you probably already know. Reality doesn't have to be the way it is. It really depends. It really depends on you, I think.
Oh, David,
so,
can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. As we have many audience still here, and I think if it's possible that we give 2 to 3, like a very short chance, like let the audience, if they have some question, come to their mind now and wants to like just they can speak directly to each professor that talk a little bit, because I think it's a great chance that we can have the access.
Yeah.
Face-to-face
Well,
discussion.
I don't mind staying a little longer, but it is dinner time here in Los Angeles. So
okay.
it is sleep time in New York.
Yeah, definitely.
So I don't want to demand too much from my friends with their time. But
Sure.
how do you guys feel about grabbing a couple of questions from our group here?
If it's a limited number, I do have to eat dinner. My wife's expecting me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
mine too. My children are getting very angry at me. Yeah.
Okay. Then, or maybe we can just like end here. I think, but definitely, I think really thank you everyone for coming, especially our guests. It's really amazing talk, and really thanks Global Knowledge LeiFeng and all the audience for coming and for support our event. We're gonna think about also organize this, definitely not only this time. So we're gonna have a serious future talk in terms of triple law and other issue based on LeiFeng. So please pay attention to that. And we're gonna also release this record for today's discussion, and we're gonna put it into archive and make it into Chinese. We're gonna release it, and we will see soon. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I have a feeling we're all gonna meet again, so we don't have to do everything today. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Good. I think so I also urgent to go to dinner.
What's that?
So I mean, are you in a rush to go to dinner, or you can stay a little bit longer?
I could maybe stay for 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, maybe I think if we still have a question, I think we can ask David directly. We can also open our audio if you want. So feel free to type your question or type in the chat that you want to ask questions. And we encourage you to speak directly to David if you have any questions. Yeah. Yeah, you can just unmute yourself as well if you want. Yeah.
Can we ask a question, or it's like we have to wait to answer that question first?
No, I think you can just speak if you want to ask.
Yeah,
what is
sure.
Your question?
Yeah. Okay. I'm a composer, so I mean, like, not architect, but I think it's really related. So I want to ask the question about the time domain about architecture. So when you talk about the transition moment or transition strategy, would you like to design more like a time-based form or forms or possibilities for individual or collective experiences for the, let's say, audiences or participants? And or like how does like a short or long-term memories impact your design?
Wow, that's not an easy question. Even before philosophy, I was trained since I was a little child in music. And when I was finishing my philosophy degree, it was like architecture or music. was a very difficult decision for me, and then I went for architecture. My friend Sanford Kwinter, who's a famous architecture theorist, recently we're talking a lot about music, and we've been texting each other constantly during this quarantine late at night about our jazz record collection, and also we're also talking about seriality, and because we're also very interested in Stockhausen, and Sanford said the most amazing thing. Said there's nothing quite like music for engaging our nervous system and our sensorium, that it just kind of plugs into our nervous system like nothing else. It just jacks in, you know, like direct connection, like maybe completely circumventing cognition, and goes right into our nervous system, so we feel things immediately. And he said, you know, I think, you know, he and I, we spent our whole lives then thinking about architecture, and we both, you know, we strive for music, but end up settling for architecture. Yeah. And I thought that was one of the most profound things I've ever heard. So we've heard stupid comparisons like architecture is frozen music and things. It's not, you know, it really isn't. Music is something else entirely. There is maybe some degree of temporality in architecture too, maybe, you know, but throughout the architectural history, architecture, it is so built into the architectural history. It is this incredibly artificial attempt to eliminate time. So one of the fundamental principles of buildings is permanence. You know, to make it look like it's stable, it's not going to fall down, it's not going to be thrown away tomorrow, it's going to last forever. When you buy a house, you don't buy a house thinking like 10 years from now it's going to be destroyed and the new one's going to be done. You buy a house thinking it's going to be there forever. You know? And this is just built into the architectural concept, I think, from the beginning, you know, permanence.
Yeah, because like I have like my favorite composer is actually from the architect's background. The Greek composer Zadakis, yeah, because he mentioned about something, I don't know, like how, like I think is very similar in the architecture and the composition, the in time and out of the time experience, especially the out of the time. Like the real composition is not improvisation. It's like you can design the end before you design the beginning.
Okay, so, okay, you're gonna have to. You're obviously very cool. Send your email to Yiqun, okay? And we're gonna email each other, okay? We're gonna talk about this a little more.
Okay, thank you.
This is not a simple conversation, and there's no way I can just give a simple answer. I mean, there is no answer, and sure. I think architecture is famous for being bad about time. Architecture has always been about producing an illusion in space that time doesn't exist. And there are interesting moments in architectural history where architects have tried to deal with the problem of duration and change, rhythm, but never successfully. Attempts to do so resulted in a lot of bad architecture, I must say. So Xenakis's collaboration with Le Corbusier is interesting, but it's not as good as his music. You know, it's kind of cheesy. You know, it's basically the score just got turned into a window. You know, just like divisions in a window, or the rhythm got turned into a line moving through space describing a curvilinear surface, like in the Phillips Pavilion. It's bullshit. It's not music. It's just some bogus attempt to try to deal with temporality in architecture, but these are not great buildings, and they're kind of strange buildings. They're outside of the normal history of great architecture. So I think there's something peculiar about what architecture does. What it does well is, I think, what I was talking about, and maybe that's something musicians are envious about architecture. The ability of architecture to alter the physical reality of space is something that music does not do. Music,
right.
like I said, enters our nervous system and is very private in some ways. And when it is in space, you're in architecture. You're performing music in a building. So there is a funny relationship, but it's not as simple as people would like to think, that one is a kind of spatial version of music, and it's not that. Anybody that's done a little bit of music knows that it has absolutely nothing to do with making a building. So they're not similar at all, I would say. Yeah.
I strongly agree and disagree of other things. So I will email you about the details. I let others.
Do that.
Yeah,
do that.
sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Maybe we can do one or two. If you want to talk, you guys, very welcome.
By the way, there are musicians out there that have been influenced by Graham Harman and have a kind of object-oriented approach to music.
And I
Graham's thoughts has affected a lot of different fields. And
David, I think
different ways.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the musician composer, I think the hyperobjects, the name of the hyperobjects which Timothy Morton mentioned, is also generated from the music. I think he got the inspiration from that. So,
yeah, the last chapter, the asymmetrical, the asymmetry word, like the very last chapter, the hyperobject.
Yeah. I know Tim's into music, and he collaborates with Bjork. So,
oh yeah.
I don't know what he's doing with her, but he is very interested in music.
Okay, so we have one question typed in the chat that I was wondering what David thinks about the relation between architecture, buildings, and city. Okay, I think this question is pretty big, but I would say maybe David, you can relate a little bit to your research recently, the AI and the cyborg misreading. I think it's brandly like something like you are using this AI tech and explore with the studio students in terms of this kind of architecture and city issue. Maybe you can mention a bit based on that. And also later we can refer to your YouTube online open critique in terms of that option studio in SCI-Arc. But I think maybe you can raise a little bit of AI and architecture and city.
Sounds like you're changing the question though.
Oh, really?
Wait, you said the question was the relationship between something, buildings, and city?
Yeah, because if you see the chat, there is architecture and city, but I think my personal feeling is like recently your research using AI has many projects like related to this issue. Yeah, maybe you can talk and whatever you want. I just like say something I feel like it have some deep structure related.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like I don't know, like what I could say about like all of that. Like I have very narrow interests. So I'm not some guru that could answer questions about the meaning of life and things like that, or so like you're right, that question of architecture, buildings, and cities. Well, what else is there? So it's almost like a question about everything, so I guess maybe we spent 2 hours talking about maybe object-oriented ontology just being a way to see the world in a new way, and to think about your relationship to other things in a new way. So like, for example, I guess now I have music on my mind, like same problem there. You have the composer, then the instruments and the musicians would perform it, and then, you know, just like the architect, you know, you got the workers and then the materials, and, you know, the composer or the architect is on top, you know. And I guess that's the thing I most dislike. That is the thing that I'm most against. You know, this for me, it's just a myth. You know, that there's like this head on top. You know, and everything else has to serve the head. You know, and it's just not like that. You know, the best work I've done in my career has always come through paying extremely close attention to the things I have to work with, and letting it speak to me as much as I'm speaking to it, you know. So, and allowing my own thinking to be changed by the things that I have to work with, you know. So I think that might be the most important, I guess, advice about this. You know, if there is a different way to do things, the different way to do things is maybe to not chase some mythology of being some genius or some master, you know, or some star, you know, architect or, you know, celebrity, but really try to pay more attention to the small things that you have to work with, and allow that to I think you can open up new worlds by looking at the smallest things very, very carefully. So, for example, my favorite composers are people that looked at the instruments in completely new ways, like spending an entire year just listening to one violin and just as though it's some kind of mystery, and where you're just listening to it over and over again to completely change some idea about a violin's role in an orchestra, for example, which then leads to completely new decisions about how to make a score. So I'm more interested in this kind of thing. We basically call that innovation, right? You know, and you don't just innovation is not easy. And innovation is not something you do through imitation. Imitation comes from looking at things very carefully and letting go of previous ideas of what's possible. You know, probably the biggest obstacle to innovating or producing something new is you're too trapped in some idea from the past about the way things are supposed to be done. You know? But it's not easy to open up new possibilities. It's not easy at all. It takes a lot of concentration and work.
Okay, David, I think yeah, I think maybe we have the last question. Yeah, I think somebody is asking for that. So the little fox, do you want to ask a question? I think I would encourage you just open your audio, talk to David directly, if it's okay.
Okay, so firstly, thank you for your speech today. I'm currently still a high school student, so I apologize if my question is not so academic or accurate. So I'm currently looking at the book of Hayduke, and I noticed that poetry has occupied a large proportion of its creation in the last century. So I'm actually a literature student, partly in high school. So my question is, how can such an abstract way of producing art to influence our practical architectural design? Like, from my perspective, writing poetry is a highly subjective thing that we might project our subjective matters to the outside world, and it is a reflection of how we see the reality. So how can such a subjective thing being balanced with the, say, physical property of the object itself? How can we balance such an subjective thoughts and objective object in the real world and in our architectural design? Is there an example in the OOO? Thank you.
Did you say you are a high school student?
Yes, I'm actually in grade 12 and I'm gonna to enter
Wow.
UCL.
Wow. You're very sophisticated. You're going to have no problem at all. Another very complex question. And I remember your question from the printout I got from Yiqun about, yeah, so I read that question. I deliberately avoided that because of how difficult that question is. Michael Young, who is here, he is a professor at the school that John Haydock made so famous, the Cooper Union in New York City. John Haydock is a very strange architect, and in the best possible way. We use the word strange a lot, and there was nobody stranger than John Haydock. You are right. He does seem to incorporate literary poetic techniques in his approach to architectural form. And you're also right that John Haydock was for 30 years criticized in architecture for being too much of a poet. Some people loved it, some people couldn't stand it. Yeah. To this day, people are still obsessed with John Haydock. If you go to Cooper Union, you go to a review or an event at Cooper Union, they still talk about John Haydock. In the middle of a review, my first review at Cooper Union, somebody said, I wonder what John would think about this project. And I kind of looked around, who's John? Like, where's John? What are you talking about? And Michael Young said, they're talking about John Haydock. And I thought, my God, are you serious? Because John Haydock was already dead for 5 years. Yeah. This is the kind of influence he still casts. It is kind of like cult of personality almost. His subjectivity was just so big, it still has influence to this day. So when one individual subjectivity becomes almost like a force of nature, I guess it becomes a kind of object too. Like the wind, like it's like you could see the people affected by it, and that's very peculiar, that personalities can do this, I myself, I'm very skeptical of that type of artist. In my own work, I try as hard as I can to be objective and clinical, almost like a doctor, because for me, this is the way to make the strangest things. And it's the only way I know to make the things I don't know how to make yet. So if I'm kind of cult of personality, everything is about David Rue and what would David Rue do? Like I actually know architects who talk like this. Peter Eisenmann does this. On reviews, I've heard Peter Eisenmann say, what would Peter Eisenmann think? And this is Peter Eisenmann saying that, it's like, who talks like this, like, talking about themselves like they're another person, and the problem with this over dedication to subjectivity is you end up obsessing about what would you do, and you end up doing the same thing over and over and over again until you just get sick of yourself. I guess I get sick of myself faster than most people. The moment I figure out how to do something, I don't want to do it anymore because I'm already sick of it. I feel and maybe that's just an odd thing about me, and maybe why I'm so attracted to the way Graham thinks, because it is the way I think too. It's maybe not so much him. I'm trying to figure out what Graham Harman's. That's like I'm doing it in architecture, he's doing it in philosophy, but we basically have similar attitude about the world. I think for me, it's the moment I feel like my subjectivity has become known, that's when subjectivity is becoming a prism. That's just me, I think, maybe, not everybody, but so when my students, the advanced students, when it's time for them to do a thesis project, like Yiqun did, you know, when he graduated from SCI-Arc, everybody does this. Well, what kind of project do I do? What's going to be my signature, my style? You know, what's going to be me? You know, and I think that's almost. I tell my thesis students that's like a guarantee you're going to fail, because you're going to end up spending the whole time obsessing over who you are and who you think you are in self-investigation, and you're not going to end up doing anything. I tell them that, a little bit harsh, but I tell them, I don't care if you do something that's you or somebody else. I just care about you doing a great work. And to do that, you better stop wasting time obsessing about who you are, and instead just start studying the materials and the techniques and the ways of doing things and the politics of how you get work done, and just start working. You know, so that's my attitude about it. That's why I say I have a more of a clinical approach. You know, like can you imagine going to a doctor, and the doctor goes, what would I do here? What would be the right style of doing this surgery? You know, let me think about it. You know, while the person's dying. You know, yeah. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You know, to tie one's subjectivity to the thing you're doing at that moment. You know, so like in the end, it becomes obvious anyway. Like everything I've done, every project I've done, every creative thing I've done, everybody knows who did it. They know, oh yeah, David Rue does that, Ferda Kolatan would never do that. So subjectivity eventually emerges, even though you never even had to think about it. It emerges because out of your decisions and out of your doing, you know, and I just think that's such a healthier, maybe more contemporary way of working. You know, otherwise, like when you're there's a reason why John Haydock, you know, is an architect that's historical. That's an old book you probably found in the library, or somebody gave it to you, or on your parents' bookshelf. John Haydock, he was an architect in the 70s and 80s. Why on earth would you want to do that? You know, that's ancient history. But as you know, 60s, 70s, 80s, America was famous for that sort of thing. This kind of obsessive hippie, you know, individual kind of thing. You know, I just don't think a kind of strong form of subjective work is all that relevant in the 21st century. So.
Thank you, David. Okay, I think today we're pretty at the end, and thanks for everyone for coming, and really thanks for David stay so late together with us. I would say like it's really charming that we use this conversation to trace the trajectory back to 10 years where OOO emerged in the architecture field. Actually, David is the only one I would say takes the responsibility that single-handedly introduce OOO into architecture field. So I would say like hope in the future we organize more this kind of online format discussion, which is really helpful to open the window between different countries, architects and scholars and architecture students. I think it's really helpful and beneficial for both sides, I would say. And I think next time, really like hope that David will like appear again and bring some new face. I think we can think about that and we can make some things. Yeah.
You know, before I click the leave button, I just want to say the more we talk and have exchanges between the United States and China, the better, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Not less, more. Yeah.
Really appreciate that. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's think about next time who we bring here together.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Nice to meet
Thank
all
you.
of you.
Sure. Thank you.
Bye
Thank you so
now.
much for your
Bye,
time.
everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
My pleasure. I enjoyed
Thank
it.
you. Amazing.
Bye
Thank
now.
you.
Actually, today we invited some professors from the top universities in China. They don't have enough time to speak, but next time we can communicate further.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye now.
Okay. Bye, David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.